Hi, I'm your host, Sabrina Rice, here on Paradigm Shift, a brand new show here on KBN Television, where we challenge the way that you think about things and dare you to face the truth. Today we have a hot topic, a myth of American slavery, so you don't want to miss this one. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hello, and welcome back to the show Paradigm Shift. I'm your host, Sabrina Rice, and I'm here with our star of the show, Ray Mcberry, who is a former Republican candidate for governor of Georgia and has been seen on other shows such as Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and hundreds of other radio and television shows across the country. So, Ray, we have an exciting topic today on myth of American slavery. Can you give us a little bit about how and when did slavery begin in America, to start us off?
I sure can. You know, there are a lot of myths about slavery in America. Today we've got a lot of increased racial tension across the country. Right. Some of us think that there are individuals that are intentionally trying to create this environment, but a lot of it is because there are some misunderstandings about the truth, about where slavery came from, how it originated, how it took place, and what happened during the years of slavery and afterwards. And so I hope that on this show we can address some of those myths, some of those things that are not true, and try to bring some light to the way things actually occurred. Right. I think that in doing so, hopefully the goal is that there will be a greater understanding of all the races that were involved in slavery, right, about what actually transpired, and hopefully it'll make a difference in where we go moving forward in the country. Here in America, originally there were 13 English colonies. The very first slaves that were brought here to the American continent were actually not brought by the English at all. They were brought by the Spanish. The Spaniards had colonized Florida, they had colonized Mexico and the islands of the Caribbean, okay, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba. All of those were Spanish possessions, and they had initially enslaved the American Indians who were living in those areas. Right. They also brought slaves over from the continent of Africa, right, to their American colonies. So the original slaves that were brought here by the Spanish. The first slaves that were brought to the American colonies, which were English colonies, of course, at the time, was in 1630, 10 years after the founding of Plymouth Rock, right, by the Pilgrims up in Massachusetts. There were Dutch traders who brought the first African slaves here to the American colonies. Okay. So it was, again, not the English that brought them, not the Americans that brought them. Right. It was first the Spanish and then the Dutch. But there were slaves, black slaves from Africa, that were here in the American colonies all the way from 1630 on, up until after the war between the states in the mid-1800s. So that's the origin of it. Of course, there has been slavery, though, that has taken place in every country of the world, right, among every different people of the world, for the entire history of mankind. There's no group of people on the planet that has ever not had slaves. And so this concept, this idea that there's just one race or one group of people that's responsible for slavery, right, around the world, right, it's all false.
So it's not unique to America.
That's correct. Okay. It's not unique to America. It's not unique to white people. Right. Every race and every nation that's ever existed up until the mid-1800s had always had slaves before. In fact, the tribes in Africa, from which many of the African slaves came, they practiced slavery of their own. They enslaved other African tribes. Today, in fact, there's still slavery in the world. Many people don't realize there's still slavery in the world. Muslim countries today, in varying degrees, still practice slavery. In fact, in the Sudan, in Africa today, the Muslims who are Marxists, communists, they have killed and enslaved most of the Christian population in Sudan. They're all black on both sides, black Africans that have enslaved each other. The Muslims have enslaved the Christians, and literally murdered millions of them. And it's been very interesting. One of the most striking photos I've ever seen, the Christians in Sudan, who are black Africans, they wave the Confederate battle flag because they see it as a symbol of freedom from tyranny and independence. And they use the Confederate battle flag in standing up to the Muslim population in Sudan, who has enslaved many of the Christians there.
Wow. And again, in the South, people are very passionate, and there's a lot of, history behind that. Can you tell us a little bit about how, slaves were treated in the South?
I can, and there's a lot of misunderstanding. It's mostly because of Hollywood. Hollywood is responsible for most of the misperceptions that people have about slavery. First of all, let's take it just from a purely economical standpoint. Slave owners, whether it was in the South or in the North, when slavery existed in America, they were not generally going to mistreat and abuse their slaves, because if for no other reason, if you have a slave and you mistreat him, you abuse him, how much work is he going to do for you? In fact, if you beat him, how much work is he going to be able to do for you? Yeah. So from a purely economic standpoint, it was nothing like what has been portrayed. But in the South, in particular, slavery was much different than what it has been portrayed. It's been portrayed that Southerners beat their slaves, they hung them if they were unruly. None of that was true. First of all, there were laws in all the Southern states that forbid slave owners from abusing, mistreating their slaves. In fact, the rules or the laws that existed in the Southern states regarding the treatment of slaves almost entirely came from laws that were given to Israel in the Old Testament about how they were to treat slaves. The Bible in neither the Old Testament nor the New Testament prohibits slavery, but but God said to Israel, if you're going to have slaves, here are the rules that you have to follow. And almost every Southern state, in fact all of them to my knowledge, had those same laws in place that Israel had in place that were given to Israel by God. So they were not allowed to mistreat and abuse and torture their slaves or kill them. You could actually, you could be condemned if you killed a slave. So you couldn't just mistreat and abuse them. In fact, there are stories from the years before the war between the states, as I call it, the War of Northern Aggression, the Civil War, in which slaves actually, at the end of the day, whatever time they had, they were free to do whatever they wanted to. They could grow their own food, have their own plot of ground, most of them did, that their owners gave to them for their own purposes. They could also, if they were blacksmiths or carpenters, they could use their skills to make money for themselves. In fact, in a very well-known book, The Defense of Virginia, where life is described the way it was in the South before the war, there are stories that are given, actual accounts of slaves actually loaning money to their masters who got in financial difficulty, because the relationship between master and slave, for the most part, in the South anyway, was normally a very good relationship. And people that doubt these stories, they say that never happened. Well, in the Great Depression in the 1930s, one of the things that the federal government did is it paid out-of-work writers, out-of-work authors, to go around and interview all of the former slaves that were still living at the time. They're called the slave narratives. You can still find a lot of these writings online. You can find them in books that are in bookstores. And it gives the personal accounts of the slaves about how they were treated and what life was like under slavery. And when you read those accounts, you see that it's not anything like what Hollywood has portrayed it to be. And so a very different picture.
Now, is there any comparison to how they were treated in the North?
Yes, in fact, there were a number of northern states who not only allowed slaves, and there were slaves, almost 500,000 slaves in the northern states at the outbreak of the Civil War. There were, of course, many more in the South, but it was basically owing to the fact that the soil was much more conducive to large plantations in the South than it was in the North. Mm-hmm. But there were still, again, about 430,000, almost 500,000 slaves in the northern states at the outset of the war. But regarding the treatment of freed blacks, in the South, freed blacks were treated, they were allowed to own property and basically carry on business, do everything but vote, basically. In the northern states, though, freed blacks were not even allowed to live there. Wow. In the black codes in both Indiana and Illinois, and in some of the other northern states, a freed black could not even stay within the state of Illinois more than 2 weeks at a time, because if they were, they would be beaten and run out of the country or placed in prison.
Wow.
And so freed blacks up north were not treated nearly like they were in the South. In fact, an unusual story that most people don't know is that the largest slaveholder in Louisiana before the war was actually a black doctor who was a black free man. He owned more slaves than anybody else in Louisiana. So it was a black man that owned black slaves. Again, that's something that you won't find in most of the history books.
Wow. And I know that you mentioned war. Now, when it comes to the big topic of Civil War, do you feel like that is parallel with American slavery? Or what is your take on that?
Well, Sabrina, I know most people have been told that slavery was the cause of the war, and that the South seceded because they wanted to keep their slaves and the North wanted them to be freed.
Right.
Nothing could be further from the truth. Again, this is an incorrect perception that's been cast upon the American people because the history books, by and large, have been written in the North since the war was over. But there's some very, very simple evidence to show and to demonstrate that that wasn't the case at all. First of all, when Lincoln became president, he knew that the southern states were planning to secede and to leave, not because of anything to do with their slaves, but because they knew that his view of government was that there should be an all-powerful federal government that could tell the states what to do, and the southern states didn't want any part of that because that's not what the Constitution said, and it's not the heritage that their fathers had given to them. Most of their fathers had fought the war for independence from Great Britain. They didn't want an all-powerful central government, and so they decided to leave. Of course, Lincoln wanted to do whatever he could to keep them in the Union. So he had a member of Congress propose the originally proposed 13th Amendment to the Constitution, and he personally promised to support it as president. And it said that if the South would stay in the Union, that the federal government would forever leave the institution of slavery alone. So basically, the South could keep their slaves if they would stay in the Union. Well, the South wasn't seceding over the issue of slavery, so they went ahead and seceded anyway. They didn't want an all-powerful federal government like Lincoln wanted to set up. And so that shows by itself that they could have kept their slaves if they just stayed in the Union. So the war wasn't fought over the issue of slavery. It was a propaganda measure that Lincoln used to try to increase morale for his northern troops fighting against the South about halfway through the war. But that's not why the South seceded in the first place. In fact, the South also, in the Confederate Constitution, prohibited any more slaves being brought into the country. So the Southern Constitution, the Constitution of the Confederate States of America, outlawed the slave trade before the United States ever outlawed the slave trade. Another fact of history that most people don't know. Now, our cameraman's telling us we're out of time, but when we come back, Sabrina, I want us to talk about some of those things that happened with the slaves both during and after the war, because I think that will be eye-opening for the viewers as well.
Well, there you go. Stay tuned. We have a lot more interesting things coming right up. Welcome back to our show, Paradigm Shift, where we're discussing the myths of American slavery. And Ray, wow, so we've already talked a lot about the history of slavery, and I know that we're talking a lot about President Abraham Lincoln. Now, again, can you give us a little bit about his views on slavery and maybe even, before the war?
Yeah, there are a lot of people who have the impression that Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator, the great savior of the black race here in America. Abraham Lincoln did not in any way have the views that most people, including most black Americans, think that he held about the black race or about slavery in general. In fact, we'll put it up so you can see the exact quotes. I don't have it memorized exactly, but President Lincoln basically said of the black race that he did not think they were equal to the white race and did not think they would ever be equal to the white race, and that he was not in favor of them ever being allowed to vote, hold office, or marry white people. Wow. And so those are things, views about the black race that Abraham Lincoln said publicly that most people don't know about today, because our history books have been so watered down and changed to fit what some people today want us to think.
Right.
So very interesting.
So what exactly were his views on slavery then?
Again, on slavery, much like his views on the black race in general, his views were not what they're portrayed to be. He did not start the war to free the slaves. He started the war to force the South to stay in the Union, because in 1860, approximately 75% of all taxes going into the federal government were paid by Southern states.
Right.
So that's why he wanted to keep the South in the Union. As the war continued to go on, though, the war wasn't going that well for President Lincoln, and in fact it looked like England and France might get involved in the war on the side of the South and actually come to the South's aid and defeat the North.
Right.
So in order to try to gain the moral high ground, President Lincoln in 1863 issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right.
We'll talk about that in a minute. But before he did that, his view on slavery was before the war, and it's you can find it in plenty of places. His public view was that if the South, if allowing the South to keep their slaves would keep them in the Union, he was willing to let them keep their slaves. If doing away with slavery would hold the Union together, he'd do away with slavery. His object was not really to free the slaves or keep the slaves. He didn't really care either way, like people think he did.
Right.
His goal was simply to keep the South in the Union. And so, again, we'll have that on the screen for people to see, but very different than what the history books say.
So the Emancipation, Proclamation, that wasn't necessarily to free the slaves then. Is that what you're telling us?
Well, the Emancipation Proclamation says that it's freeing the slaves, but if you carefully read what it says, it only frees the slaves in the states that are still in rebellion to the federal government. Now, again, we'll argue it for another time on another show. The South wasn't in rebellion against the federal government. The South left the United States and formed their own separate country, so they weren't trying to take over the federal government. But Lincoln called it a rebellion because it played good propaganda-wise in the newspapers. So the only slaves that were freed by the proclamation were slaves that were in parts of the South that were still under Southern control. Now, a president in the North saying that he was freeing the slaves in the South, he didn't have the authority or the ability to free them, so it basically didn't have any effect. It didn't free any of them. And the portions where the North controlled, including the original northern states and the portions of the South that had been taken over by the Yankee soldiers, those slaves that lived there, none of them were freed. It only freed the slaves in the part of the South that he didn't control. So in effect, the Emancipation Proclamation never freed a single slave. It was totally a propaganda measure designed to give him the moral high ground and try to keep England and France from getting involved in the war. And it worked. They didn't get involved in the war because they didn't want to be perceived as fighting to help perpetuate slavery, because England had already abolished slavery there.
Well, did the slaves revolt from the South during the war?
Good question. The slaves did not revolt here in the South. In fact, had it not been for the slaves in the South could not have continued the war for the 4 long years that we did. Right. Not only were there blacks who fought for the South, which again you won't see in Hollywood movies, there were blacks, both free blacks and slaves, who volunteered to fight for the Confederacy because they viewed it as their country too. And they had very different relations with their masters than what is portrayed in Hollywood. And so there were many black Confederates. Mm-hmm. There also were a lot of slaves that stayed at home on the plantations and the family farms that continued to work the farms, work the plantations, work in the cotton mills. And had it not been for those blacks back home mm-hmm. working to keep the economy going during the war, the Southern Army could not have stayed in the field for 4 years. Wow. It was the blacks back home who, there weren't white men back home guarding them, watching them. Right. But they continued to run the farms, run the plantations because it was their livelihood, and they viewed it as their families. Mm-hmm. And they were doing it to prevent this invasion as well. And so they basically kept the economy going voluntarily so that the South was able to last for 4 years against a much more industrialized northern enemy.
Right. So what happened to the slaves after the war?
That's one of the things that's been left out of the books as well. Many of the slaves who were supposedly freed mm-hmm. by the Yankee Army after the war was over, they suffered the same fate as most white Southerners after the war. Mm-hmm. During Reconstruction, the Southerners, white and black, had basically no way of providing for themselves. Their crops had all been burned by the northern armies as they marched through. Of course, here in Georgia, Sherman's marched to the sea, but it didn't just go on in Georgia. It went on through the Carolinas, it went on through Louisiana and Mississippi. In Mississippi alone, records indicate that somewhere between a fourth and a third of all the blacks in the state of Mississippi died in the 10 years after the war. Wow. Because there wasn't food to be had. The Yankees had burned everything and confiscated all of the farms. And so the black Southerners ended up suffering the same fate as the white Southerners after the war during the years of Reconstruction.
Wow. Now, but going back to the treatment of them, do you feel like that the northern leaders were a little bit more sympathetic to the slaves than the southern leaders, or what's your take on that?
Well, that's certainly what the history books would like us to believe. Mm-hmm. You know, those blacks after the war, they basically, the federal government, whenever the Yankee Army marched into an area, mm-hmm. they didn't free the slaves like a lot of people think. They confiscated the slaves as contraband, military supplies. And so basically the slaves became the property of the federal government as the Yankee Army marched through all the different southern states. Many people think that they just gave them their freedom, patted them on the back and said, you know, we wish you well. That wasn't the case. They forced them into the Union Army or to work for the Union Army, and they literally became the property of the U.S. government until after the war was over. And of course, the federal government after the war created the Freedmen's Bureau to give them land and a mule and so forth. But the truth is, the slaves who had been freed continued to be dependent on the federal government. Right. And some would argue that, you know, the ownership of the slaves was simply transferred from the southern planters to the federal government, and the descendants of those slaves in some ways remain slaves to the federal government to this very day because they're still being controlled and made dependent on the federal government to this very day.
So with the war, though, wouldn't we still have slavery today if it wouldn't have been for the war?
That's a good question. Slavery had already died out naturally in England, other countries around the world. It was already in the process of dying out here in America too. In fact, most of the southern states had already begun to introduce legislation in their state legislatures that would gradually emancipate the slaves, and over time would gradually do away with slavery. There were even proposals introduced in Congress for the government to purchase slaves from slave owners, give them their freedom, and but that way the slave owners would be compensated for the money they had spent, not only in buying the slaves, but also in taking care of them, providing them a place to live, food to eat, clothes to wear. And so it would recompense the slave owner, and they'd therefore be willing to give up their slaves if they were compensated for them. All of those were shot down by the northern merchants that were involved in the slave trade. A lot of people don't know it, but there was not a single slave trading ship that was ever registered to a southern state. All of the Americans that were involved in the slave trade were northern businessmen who took their ships to Africa or the West Indies, got the black slaves, and then brought them to southern ports to sell. Some of the very wealthy and politically connected families in New England today up north got their wealth originally from selling slaves in southern ports. And so that's something that's not well known either. Some of the northern commanders, General Ulysses S. Grant, for example, he and his wife owned slaves not only before the war, but during the war. During the war, it's reported, we don't know if it's true or not, but it's reported that because he owned slaves, his wife was asked during the war, why didn't she free her slaves since her husband was off fighting the South? And she is reported to have said, good help is hard to find. And I don't know if she actually said that, but the fact that he and his wife still owned slaves while he was fighting the South.
Was a huge statement.
Yeah, it shows that he was not fighting the war to end slavery. Most Northerners were not fighting the war to end slavery. They had been drafted and were being forced to fight against the South. Likewise, in the South, a lot of the Southern leaders were just like the common Southern people. They weren't against black people. Robert E. Lee inherited slaves from his father-in-law. He freed them all before the war ever started because he wanted them to be free, and it was the wishes of his father-in-law before he passed away. So Robert E. Lee freed his slaves before the war ever started. President Jefferson Davis, the only president so far of the Confederacy, during the war, he and his family came upon an orphaned black boy in the streets of Richmond, Virginia, the southern capital, and they basically adopted him, took him into their home. He lived in the Confederate White House as the adopted son of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis, was treated like the rest of President Davis's children. His name was Little Jim. Little Jim Limber was his full name. But Jim lived with him. At the end of the war, when President Davis's family was arrested and captured by Union soldiers, they ripped the little boy Jim Limber out of Mrs. Davis's arms, and she said, "No, he's my son. He's not a servant." And the Union soldiers took Jim Limber off, and the Davis family never saw him again.
Oh, wow.
Today, we don't know what happened to him. But again, here's the president of the Confederacy, adopts an orphan black boy, makes him part of his own family, and it's the Union soldiers that take him away, never to be seen again. General Stonewall Jackson, probably the most famous Confederate general during the war. He actually taught a black Sunday school class before the war. During the war, while he was away fighting a battle, at the end of the Battle of, I think it was Fredericksburg, at the end of the day, in his tent, he wrote a letter to the pastor back home apologizing for forgetting to send his offering for the black Sunday school class.
Wow.
And so he sent that back by mail. These are stories that you never hear because white Southerners are portrayed as people that hate black people. The Northerners, the federal government, are portrayed as loving black people. It actually was the opposite. Black people have more in common here in the South with white Christian Southerners than they do the atheist white people that believe in evolution and other things like that.
Well, and going back to it, do you feel that the race relations were worse with the North and South? Do you feel like that it made it worse with that?
They were made worse after the war was over,
right.
whereas they weren't necessarily bad before.
Okay.
But the federal government's involvement in forcing both whites and blacks to do things they didn't want to do and to be forced together in ways they didn't choose to be forced together, instead of living peacefully and happily side by side as neighbors, that was really the crux of it. We have some more information I wanted to cover today, but I know we're out of time, so maybe in another upcoming show we'll talk about some of these other things.
Sounds great. Make sure to keep staying tuned, and we'll be right back on your show, Paradigm Shift. Well, that does it for today's show. We hope that you've enjoyed some insightful facts about myths of American slavery. We hope that you will join us again for next week's episode. And again, remember that the truth will set you free. Until then, I'm your host, Sabrina Rice. Have a nice day.